Will Schwalbe has worked in publishing as the founder and CEO of Cookstra.com and as a journalist writing for various publications, including the New York Times and the South China Morning Post. He's the author of the New York Times bestseller, The End of Your Life Book Club, and co-author with David Shipley of Send, Why People Email So Badly and How to Do It Better. We're here today to talk about reading and his book, Books for Living, published by Knopf. Welcome to the Bibliophile.
Thank you, Nigel. Thanks for having me on the Bibliophile.
First off, the book is so beautiful and bright and really puts me in mind of the old Faber colors, certainly.
It's funny, that may have to do with the fact that I was lucky enough to have as my editor, the legendary publisher Sonny Mehta, who came out of British publishing, master marketer and heavily influenced by the look of classic British books, and in fact was one of the great contributors to that look.
Isn't that lovely? I got to know him right at the very end of his life. I was so disappointed. I think I'd known him for about 2 months before he died. But we got together, we had some drinks, and it was just such a loss.
Such a loss. He's such an extraordinary man, a wonderful man, a great friend to me, a great friend to so many authors, and there was nobody who had a mind like Sonny's. His ability to see to the heart of things was unparalleled, but famously, and I'm sure you saw that when you had drinks, you had to stop talking and you had to listen. He was very quiet and not afraid of silence.
That's what everyone told me beforehand. Yes, that I shouldn't be concerned if he didn't speak that much.
I don't mean to hijack the conversation, but I have to tell you the story about how we first met. I had a terrible case of adult chicken pox and was in bed for months, covered in pox. And the one book that got me through the chicken pox was A Fine Balance by Rohinton Mistry. Mm-hmm. And I read it holding it in front of my face. And I was so entranced by that book that I forgot about everything that was going on with me and fell in love with these characters whose situation was so much more miserable, of course, and so much more desperate and heartbreaking than my temporary problem. And when I recovered, I knew that Sonny had been the publisher of the book, and I wrote him a fan letter just saying, thank you for publishing that book. You got me through the pox. And he said, you must come and have a drink with me. I met him at a bar and we drank and talked for hours.
That book won I'm pretty sure it won the Giller Prize up here in Canada because he's Canadian.
He is indeed, yes. And one of the, I'm breathless waiting for his next book.
Well, you're going to have to read it, and that's what we want to talk about. Why do you read, Will?
Why do I read? I read for all sorts of reasons. I read to entertain myself, to educate myself, to distract myself. And I read because it's a form of meditation or almost even worship for me. It's a time when I have to be quiet and I have to listen to another voice. And I find there's nothing else in life that does for me what that does for me.
It's beautiful. You also referenced the fact that not just reading, but discussing what you've read is really important to you.
To me, that's really the primal experience. And I was very lucky to be raised in a household that had books. And I was lucky to be raised in a household around readers. And my earliest memories are of my mother reading a story to me in bed. But what I remember about that is not so much the text of the books themselves, whether it was Ferdinand the Bull or Harold and the Purple Crayon, but what I remember is the conversations we had and that marvelous way when an adult is reading to a child, the kind of meta reading that goes on. Look at Curious George. What color is the man's hat? What do you think is going to happen next? So to me, reading and the conversation you have about books form my earliest memories together, not separate.
Yeah, there's a real engagement with another human being.
Yes, it's a journey together, and it's a great equalizer too. And I think that's one of the most important things about reading. I joke about this cliche, but being put on the same page and reading on the same page.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think it's the conversation and the great equalizer. A book I love that I wrote about in another book was The Uncommon Reader by Alan Bennett, about the Queen of England discovering books and discovering that she's just a reader like anybody else.
Now, one of the things you point to in the first chapter, or actually it's in the introduction, is finding the right book at the right time and how important that is. But it's, in many cases, it's just luck. Or is it?
I would put it I'm a fairly superstitious person. So I would put it in the category of serendipity. And in fact, I really believe, and one of the things I set to do in Books for Living is show the way that the right book has found me at the right time.
Yes.
And how books have a strange way of doing that.
So there's a greater power at work, Will?
It's funny, Nigel, I've never really thought about it that way. I've just taken it that the universe will put in front of me at some point the book I need. What the universe doesn't do, and I wrote about this, is there is always the hope when you start a book that it will be the greatest book you ever read, that in some way that book will give you all the answers to every question you ever have. And the universe has come pretty close, but it hasn't done that yet. And in a way, I'm glad it hasn't done that yet, because part of the adventure of reading is to always hope that the next book is that book.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing too is it's a little bit screwed up if you find all of the answers in just one book.
Yeah, that would be a little bit screwed up. I suppose, I mean, not quite. You're right to call me out on that. That not quite all the answers, but that one insight that everything together. The epic aha moment. But again, it would be screwed up if you found it. Probably suspect if you did as well. And so I like the idea of it probably more than actually believing it could ever happen or would be a good thing if it did.
Another point you make is that books are a way to talk about painful subjects.
I've really encountered that in my life in all sorts of ways. From the practical. So for example, when I wrote the End of Your Life book club, it was about the books I read with my mother when she was dying of pancreatic cancer. Yeah. And as I said, on the very practical level, we had some how-to books, a book called The Etiquette of Illness that gave us a language for talking about illness, but also on a much deeper level. So one of the books that we found very important to ourselves was Crossing to Safety by Wallace Stegner. And Crossing to Safety starts with a couple who call to them their best friends. And the woman in this couple, Charity, is dying of cancer. And my mother and I were able to talk about whether Charity's husband would be okay after Charity died. And it would have been very, very out of keeping with our relationship and probably far too direct to talk about whether my father would be okay after my mother died. But we could talk about Charity and Larry. And for me, that became a kind of model of the way that books give you a language through character, through event, to talk about really difficult things.
They also help guide and prompt conversation. We've sort of touched on that, but.
Yeah, they do that. And I also love the fact that it is the conversation and how it can be in a disagreement about a book too, that you find yourself getting to know someone deeper because you're exploring their views, their opinions, their prejudices in a way that you might not have before. Starting with the kind of very basic, what do you think of the book, or did you like the way it ended, but going really deep into why characters do the things they do. And would you have done those things? And how would you react if people you knew did those things? I mean, we're talking a very perilous moment in the US political process. I know you're in Canada and I'm here south.
Yeah, but we feel it, believe me. Yeah, we feel it.
And as readers, it's impossible not to go back to whether it's Julius Caesar, then the tyrants of Shakespeare, to more recent books about demagogues that exist in recent American literary tradition and world literary tradition. So I find on the personal and the political level, books need that kind of conversation.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing too is, especially if you get into a disagreement, which I think is probably a healthy thing, you have to really think about why you believe certain things, and you have to be able to articulate them.
And you have, which is a blessing, a very definite set of facts that you can refer to, which are the words on the page. Yes. So with the book, you can say, no, let's go to page 23 because it says this.
Yeah, it's text driven.
It's text driven. There's an agreed upon, unfixed, unchanging text.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things when you started asking me, one of the things I look to about reading, I love that certainty that I change, but the words on the page don't.
Well, that's so true too, isn't it? You read a book when you're 20 and you read the book when you're 40. It's a different book. It's a different book.
As you know from reading books for a living, I'm obsessed with the author Lin Yu Tang.
Yes, I have a nice connection there. One of the books that I got from my grandfather was that book, and it has his signature in it. So I love
The Importance of Living by Lin Yu Tang. That's so fantastic. I was thinking of him when we were having that conversation about reading a book at a different age, because he has a quote that I love, where I'm paraphrasing badly, but he says that to read it as a book that you love as a young person is like looking at the moon through a keyhole. And to read it a little later in life is like looking at the moon through a crack in the door. But when you get to a certain age, it's like standing on a terrace and looking the moon.
That's lovely. Yeah, I like that.
It reveals itself to you as you grow and change.
Well, books also answer big questions. We've talked about pain, but also questions of how to live and how to be happy. Is that true?
Yes. I think that for me, reading is learning, it's growing, it's changing. There's the famous expression, you can never step in the same river twice. And of course, what that means is not only is the river different, but you're different. The you that steps in the river is a different you. And I really believe that the you that you encounter at the end of a book, no matter what the book is a different you than the you that started the book.
Yeah.
You learn something, change something, something's different, even if the tiniest thing. So for me, the very act of reading is to be engaged in the act of living, changing, growing. And there's a book that I write about in Books for Living, which is Zen and the Art of Archery.
Yes.
Which was the kind of foundational text of the West's enrapturement with Zen philosophy. And it's a simple book about learning to shoot an arrow. But the message of the book is you don't shoot the arrow shoots. And I find that one of the great things for me about reading is the moments of reading that I really aim for, that I long for, and that are my peak moments are when I forget that I'm reading.
Yes.
When I become so enraptured in the text that everything falls away. Yeah. And for me, I've tried to read about mindfulness. I've tried to practice mindfulness. I have way too much of a monkey mind for it. I can't do it, but I can achieve what I think is sort of the same thing when I'm reading. So in that sense too, I think just the act of reading, totally independent from what you read, helps you live more mindfully.
Yeah, it's like getting caught up in a creative process. If you're creating something, you're painting or writing or editing a podcast. If you're totally into it, then time just disappears.
Exactly. There was a marvelous book years ago. Mikhail Csikszentmihalyi wrote a book called Flow about achieving that state where you're so enraptured by what you're doing, editing a podcast, reading a book, some creative pursuit that everything else falls away. And so for me, nothing does that like reading. Not all the time, only occasionally. Usually my monkey mind is at work while I'm reading. But in the best moments, I achieve that flow.
For me, I achieved that with the Russians, with Tolstoy and Dostoevsky mostly. And I kind of wish I could get back there, but I haven't been back for quite a long time. But it's like you're rushing to get back into that world.
Yes, rushing to get back. Well, at the start of the pandemic, I needed a book that would enrapture me completely.
Yeah.
And I had adored War and Peace, but I had never read Anna Karenina.
Right.
So that was I knew it would do for me what I needed it to do. And it did exactly that. It gave me that experience.
Yeah. And for me, it's quite weird. I've tried it about 3 times now, and I can't get beyond the first 100 pages.
Anna Karenina, I had that problem too.
Same author.
I forced myself, and then once I broke through, I was there. But yeah, I had stalled out at about page 100 3 or 4 times.
Well, there's hope. Okay, getting back to why read. Reading allows you to explore topics deeply at your own pace.
Yes.
You say.
Yes. For me, that's another very important point. I mean, part of what I was doing when I was writing that section about reading that starts the book is contrasting it, at least in my own mind, with the other ways that we get information. So I was thinking, for example, of a lecture. And there could be a marvelous lecture by a brilliant professor, but you can't say to her, wait, stop. Say that again. Wait, what? I didn't quite catch that. I need to look at that.
Well, if you've got it on video, you can.
But there's something about video that screams, don't interrupt me. And I also believe when I'm watching something on video, if I stop and start it too much, I lose the train.
Yeah.
It's just not designed for that. But books, of course, are to be read as slowly or quickly as you want to read them. You can go back. And for me, and this is an important part of my reading, not everybody's, but I need to read physical books. The text on the page is important to me. I remember a couple pages back at the top on the left side, there was something that caught my eye, and I'll go back to that. And if I'm listening to a lecture, there's no equivalent to that. So yeah, I think the fact that you can read the same passage again and again and again until you get it.
Yes, you can savor it. You can sit there. You can ponder it. and there's no time frame. You just sit there and think about it till you get it.
Exactly.
Or you don't get it.
Or you don't get it and you come back to it later, or you think you got it and then it means something different. Yeah, as part of my day job, as it were, I'm a book editor. And part of being a book editor is actually just reading something again and again and then saying to the author, I don't get it.
Yes.
As I always sometimes say to authors, I say, did you want me to be bored and confused in this paragraph? Because if you did, I succeeded.
You're just referencing your remark that every book changes your life. You reference the different pathways that exist in your brain. Books create new pathways.
Yes, for me, that's very much along the lines of what I've learned about the way that we learn, just from my very amateur reading of various kinds of neuroscientists, and the idea that in our brain, we're constantly creating what you would almost think of as rope bridges. When you learn something once, it's the first rope. And when you go through it again, it's the second rope and the third rope and the fourth rope. And only when you get a certain number of ropes going across that chasm is it strong enough for you to traverse. And for me, reading does that, so that when I'm reading not just the same book again and again, but different books. So for example, if I read a Donna Leone mystery that's set in Venice, I kind of get a sense of Venice. And then I might read a history of Venice, and then I get a little more about Venice, and then a biography of someone who lived in Venice, and a little more, and then Jan Morris, and a little more. And before you know it, I have a strong sense of Venice because of all these ropes, and I've never been there. So to me, it's creating those pathways.
Yeah. Now, here you say reading is the best way to learn how to examine your life. That's a pretty big statement.
Yeah, going back to the unexamined life is not worth living. It is a big statement, but that one I also firmly believe, which is you can only examine something in reference to something else. So what makes, in my mind, a great chair? If I'd only seen one chair in my life, I don't know any chair but that chair. I can examine my life against other lives, my thoughts against other thoughts, and my beliefs against other beliefs by reading. So there are other ways to do it, but the best way I know is through reading.
This is a lovely quote. One of the few things you can do alone that makes you feel less alone. That's beautifully put.
Thank you. I think, sadly, a lot of us had that proven to us anew in this pandemic. A lot of people found themselves alone in lots of circumstances. And again, I wanted to state it because I believe it to be true in and of itself, but also because it is a contrast to social media. If you're alone and you're going through Facebook or Instagram and seeing marvelous things that other people are doing, and they're at parties and they're having fun and they're doing this and they're doing that, and you're not, it really can have the effect, I think, of intensifying your loneliness. And I think it's particularly true for young people. The experience of reading and that sense I'm not alone, there's someone who thought things I thought and felt things I felt, that other people might be reading this book, but they're not doing it without me. I'm not excluded. I can be part of this community. And I think a lot of people have discovered that power. And actually the statistics from the book industry bear it out, because book sales are one of the few things that held up.
Well, what's the difference then between the pleasure you get from reading an interesting, beautifully written book and the dopamine shots that you get when someone likes a little tweet that you put out?
The dopamine shot depends on other people.
Right.
You can sit and stare at your little screen, hoping, praying that someone will like the thing that you just posted. But if you have a bookshelf, you can go in search of that dopamine shot yourself, and you can keep reading until you find it. And so it's up to you and your bookshelf. And it's funny, for me, there are some tried and true things. There's some books I can go back to, and there are passages that always give me that little dopamine shot. Winston Churchill used to talk about visiting his bookshelf, and you can visit favorite books, or you can go in search of the new, a book that you think might give you that shot.
Yeah, this is another thing that I think you suggest that it makes you a better person. But what about these extremely well-read literature professors that end up abusing their privileges and sexually harassing their students? How does it make them better people?
I've had a lot of occasion to think about the whole empathy question with literature. I do believe that reading makes us more empathetic and does, in that sense, make us a better person. I don't think there's any way to prove that. And in fact, I've had people disagree with me, and we've had very lively conversations about it. As far as terrible people doing terrible things, or not terrible people doing terrible things, just terrible things, I don't think there's any book in the world that could inoculate against that, guard against that. So books are certainly not a panacea, but I have no proof for it, but I can't help but believe that in some sense they help. I have seen interesting studies, though I'd have a hard time citing the exact ones, that one of the most powerful things for people is to be proximate to different people.
Yeah.
That the more you live, grow up with, and spend time with people different from you, the better it is for everybody. So also part of what you read plays into that too. Reading only makes you empathetic if you read broadly, and if you read books by people who are different from you, grew up differently, and may believe different things. If you just read in that one narrow groove, it won't do much of anything for you, I don't think. And that's why this polarized society where people seek out books to confirm their prejudices and only read those books, that clearly is not helping at all.
You talk about the brain being like a commonplace book. I like that.
Yeah. Did you keep a commonplace book when you were a kid or at any time in your life?
Yeah, basically it's jotting down passages that I really like. Yes, I've done that, quite a bit of that.
I've at various points in my life done it. I did it as a kid. I became fascinated with that. I did a lot of it as a kid, and I've done it at points in my life. And then I did have this realization that that's just my brain. That at this point in my life, my brain is a commonplace book.
But the problem is, though, I find anyway, 6 months after I've read a book, I can't remember a damn thing about it. So it's not a bad idea to write it down.
It's not a bad idea. But I love memorizing. And I still have most of the poems I memorized as a kid. And I love when I'm waiting for the subway to come, or in a TSA line waiting to board a plane back in the days when we used to fly places. I love to go over the poems that are in my head and see if I can remember them. And quotes too. I'm memorizing quotes from books. But yes, you're right. It's a probably faulty, rather inaccurate commonplace book, my brain.
Well, no, but the practice of memorization is really, it's really a useful one. I'm not disciplined enough, I don't think, but I think it's healthy. It's like an exercise for your brain, isn't it?
It's an exercise for your brain, and it's a great resource, as I said, in those sort of moments when you're tempted to just check Twitter or Facebook to try to see if you can remember some poem you learned in 5th grade. I used to know all of The Midnight Ride of Paul Revere by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, and now I only know about a third of it. But maybe I'll try to recapture the rest of it again.
You say that reading broadly helps you to create your own philosophy.
Yes. The example of trying on other people's beliefs, seeing how they sit with you, seeing how they fit, keeping them or discarding them. But it has to be broadly, because otherwise you're just confirming the philosophy you already have.
Well, then you also have to go out and live it a bit too.
Yes, you have to test drive it in the real world and see how it works for you.
You've got a book club, right? Or you've had them?
I'm in a wonderful one now. I've had them in the past. Yes, I'm a book club guy.
Can you tell me about it?
The current one I'm in is a young adult book club. And there's a bunch of us, and we read middle grade and young adult books. About half the members of the group have kids. About half the members of the group don't have kids. And came from a desire to keep ourselves current, to find out what young people are reading, so we'd have a kind of common language, because there's incredible vitality in young adult books, but also to go back and reread some of the classic books that shaped us and see how they hold up and share them with each other.
So what are the benefits of a book club then?
It goes back to where we started this conversation. I go back to that primal experience of having my mother read to me in bed, and the whole metatext, the whole idea of all the conversations you have inspired by a book. And I should add, and we're very proud of this, our book club is a no shame book club, which means that if you haven't read the book, you can still show up and you can still take part in the conversation.
That doesn't work for my book club. No.
It doesn't work for yours.
Not at all. No. Yeah. If you haven't read it, then you can't show up.
So I think it would be fair to say that if you had a lot of strong opinions about the book, not having read it, that would be frowned on.
Yeah. Okay.
But, and I forgot I'm in another book club too, which is we formed on Zoom since the pandemic started.
Yeah.
And we've been reading, Willa Cather was the most recent author we've been reading in that. And I just read The Professor's House, which is such an astonishing book. And for me, that's another function that book clubs serve, which is creating that kind of serendipity, that what do I read next? In my book clubs, it's what the group decides, suggests, stumbles upon. So it introduces another level of randomness into my reading life.
I guess you get to know the people that are in the club quite a bit better, don't you?
You get to know them, and some of those things we were talking about earlier too, you get to have deeper, more substantive conversations about your life, the world, your beliefs, because you have a text to work off and things to talk about that aren't you, but allow you to talk about yourself.
Well, now we've worked our way through your introduction. Then what you do in the book is to look at specific books that have had an impact on you. And the first one you start with is Lin Yutang. We mentioned him already. The importance of living. I'll just sort of go fairly quickly through some of the books, okay? And the lessons, if you will. He rejected ambition and made a case for loafing and savoring things like food and birdsong and music. And he was very keen on travel too.
Yes. The quote from me of Lin Yutang is, if you've spent a perfectly useless afternoon doing absolutely nothing, then you've mastered the art of living.
Well, I love the line he uses, and it's the exact opposite of what Nike has chosen, and it is just do nothing.
Yes, exactly. I mean, his whole idea is that we shouldn't live to work, we should work to live, is powerful. But also, it's really important to state, and it's something I come to at the end of the book, he was writing in the late 30s, and specifically talking about the rise of Hitler and Stalin. And he was positing a humanistic worldview based on human values, art, literature, friendship, loyalty, nature, that was a contrast to the cult of greed and ambition that he thought would ruin the world from the communists and the fascists. So it starts, you think it's a marvelous book because at first you think it's very frivolous, but it actually packs a wallop. And it doesn't surprise me that your grandfather had a copy because it was the biggest bestseller of 1938 worldwide. It was like Tuesdays with Morrie on steroids.
Yeah, my grandfather spent 3 or 4 years in a Japanese prison of war camp.
Oh.
So I don't know if he had a book with him at the time, probably not, but Stuart Little by E.B. White. Unconditional love, total acceptance, loyalty. He was your first role model.
I loved Stuart. I loved his adventuresome, mischievous, but yes, the idea that E.B. White is quite sly about this idea of a mouse being born to a human family.
Yeah.
And yet he gets unconditional love. And for me, as I said, the moral was you can be that different from your parents and still not lose their love.
Yeah, it's lovely. Yeah. He was also brave and cheerful.
Brave, optimistic, and it has this marvelously enigmatic ending where E.B. White goes in search of, the Stuart goes in search of his friend, and you don't actually know if he'll ever find his mom. And at the time, librarians were outraged. You can't do that to children. You can't end a book like that. And he very strongly felt children have to learn that it's looking that's important, not finding.
Venturing forth.
Yeah.
You have a chapter discussing Girl on the Train, where figuring out who we can trust is the issue.
I'm a big fan of unreliable narrator fiction. And that, of course, is a great example of unreliable narrator fiction. And what I love about it is, again, that idea of testing your prejudices, your beliefs. And what I particularly love about that book is, for me, the lesson is sometimes the person you can't trust is yourself.
Yes. Then you suggest that mediocrity is one of the, it's okay to be mediocre, is one of the messages of the Odyssey?
So in fact, this whole book, Books for Living, started in my mind as a book about mediocrity, in praise of mediocrity. And my working titles for it were Two Cheers for Mediocrity, or just In Praise of Mediocrity. And what I meant by that was mediocrity has gotten a bad rap. That when we talk about mediocrity, we talk about it as it was something bad, but it's not. It's just the middle. That's literally what it means.
Yeah.
And so for me, the great lesson of the Odyssey is that Odysseus was really good at a lot of things.
Yeah, resourceful,
but he was thoroughly mediocre at getting home.
He had some pretty good reasons not to go home.
He had some good reasons not to go home, and he had some forces arrayed against him, but he really screwed it up a couple times. He just wasn't very good at getting home. Everybody else managed it in a couple months. It took him 10 years. But he made it home. And at the end of the day, that's what's important is, so to me, I was slightly tongue-in-cheek, but not entirely, this idea that we need to cut ourselves some slack, that just doing things is fine. You don't have to do them brilliantly.
Well, also how damaging perfectionism is.
And sometimes I think the problem with our 5-star or 1-star society is we ruin pleasures for ourselves because we're always in search of that kind of perfection. And I use the example sitting around the West Village with a friend where I live and having a decent, a piece of pizza that's really tasty, a nice cold beer, a nice cold craft beer. And you're sitting around, tasty pizza, nice cold craft beer. And your friend says, yes, but the best pizzas are to be had at...
Yeah.
And all of a sudden, your pizza doesn't taste so good anymore. And so this idea of always the best, and for me, that's true in books too. We as publishers are always saying, this introduces the most important new voice in American or Canadian literature.
Such bullshit. Yeah.
Such bullshit. And I'd love a flap copy that says, this isn't the author's best book, but there are some modest pleasures to be found in the pages. And I think some of the characters, might amuse you. There's some nice passages, not fully conceived, but worth your time. Yeah. And of course, we ruin the good, the mediocre, the happily mediocre, for this idea that everything has to be brilliant. And ultimately, what I'll say about that is, if everything is brilliant, nothing is brilliant.
Yeah. You should read some of the jacket copy that Faber put out in the 30s and 40s. It's just like that. And it's great.
I'll have to look. I'll have to find that. I would use the jacket copy example because I did come across a William Morrow book from the 1930s. Literally, the flap copy said something like, when this book came across the desk of our editors, we thought it was not entirely without merit. So,
yeah.
Oh, how great. Is that what are the Faber ones like?
Well, they really don't pump it at all. I don't have a specific example other than to say that it's really refreshing not to read all these damn superlatives that are bullshit.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, it's honest. I guess that's what I'm saying.
And
it's
then
an honest appraisal.
I would love that. I think readers might actually find that really refreshing.
Well, but they're not going to, if it's all bullshit about how fantastic it is, you're going to be disappointed most of the time.
Yeah. Yeah, I do think this is one of my more controversial opinions, that more harm is done by fantastic reviews of books that are of modest merit than by bad reviews of great books.
Yeah, yeah.
Because they raise reader expectations to a fever pitch.
They do, and typically you're disappointed when you read it. That's been my experience, and I don't want that.
Oh.
That's not why I turned to the book. But you're into cooking.
Yes.
And sharing meals with loved ones is right up there.
Yes. And cookbooks. I'm a huge fan of reading cookbooks. Cookbooks are incredible repositories of wisdom about culture, community. If you want to find out about another culture and can't travel there, there's all sorts of types of books you can read, but one of them is cookbooks. To read a great cookbook about Persian cooking is to gain great insight. I love reading cookbooks. I edit cookbooks, I read cookbooks. And so in the chapter in Books for Living, though, there's a couple of cookbooks that I pay particular attention to. And one is Edna Lewis's remarkable cookbook about Southern and country cooking. Which is a profound work of philosophy and of living with the seasons and of gratitude and about America's original sins, slavery. It's you can't believe everything that is in this cookbook, A Taste of Country Cooking.
You should get to know a friend of mine. He's an antiquarian book dealer that specializes in cookbooks. Don Lindgren is his name. Rabelais Books. You might want to check that out.
Oh, wonderful. Where is that based?
He's based in Maine, but he's just a font of knowledge when it comes to, well, any kind of cookbook, really.
Oh, great. As soon as our conversation is over, I will be on the web finding my Rabelais books. Great.
You just finally, on the books themselves, there's a book that you reference about someone traveling in his own room.
This is a book that had astonishing relevance for our current times. It is a book that I found serendipitously called A Journey Around My Room by Xavier de Maistre, who was a 1780 French count who was confined to his room for 42 days of house arrest for the crime of dueling. It was in Turin, I think, at the time. So at the time in the 18th century, there was a big vogue for travel books for soldiers on various campaigns, writing books of the lands they went to. But as he was stuck in his room for 40 plus days, he decided to write a travel book to his room. And he starts out by scooching around on his chair and visiting different parts of his room, kind of zigzagging and describing the geometry of it. And at one point he pays a visit to his dresser or to paintings on the wall or to his armoire. It's a kind of book that I particularly love. And I was speaking about the Lin Yu Tang this way, because it's a book that when it starts, it has a frivolous tone and you think that it's going to be entirely silly, charming, silly. And then it just sneaks up on you and packs a wallop. And in this book, Journey Around His Room, there are two things which really made me gasp. One is that he visits the letters of his best friend who had died in his arms of a fever on a foreign campaign. And it's only when he's confined to his room that he has the time, the mental space the attention to visit these letters and to spend time with his memories and honor his dead friend. And the other part, which just made me gasp, was at some point he visits his window. And he looks out the window and he sees in the cold these children shivering, starving on the street corner. And he realizes the ills of the world, which were right outside his window. But he was always too wrapped up in daily life and travels and this and that to see the suffering that was on his doorstep. And to me, that's such a powerful message in this time too. So it's a slight book. It was incredibly influential in the sense that it influenced writers. Lin Yutang was influenced by it. Machado de Assis, the great Brazilian author, was heavily influenced by this book as well. And it's one of the, I think, essential modernist texts, not in and of itself, but the way it influenced the writers who influenced us. And it's just a cool little book. So for me, every book has a kind of history of how I found it. And sometimes it's a person who told me about it. But in this case, because I'm so obsessed with Lin Yutang, I decided to just spend hours going through a list of the books that he left in his library.
Oh, that's lovely. Yeah. Where is this library? Do you know?
I think the bulk of it is in Taipei. This website was from the Lin Yutang Museum in Taipei.
Okay. I think another aspect of him witnessing suffering on his doorstep was this idea that books should or do motivate readers to act.
Yes, that to me is a very important concept. And it's one of the reasons I tried to in the introduction, and I'm so glad we spent some time digging into that. I tried to enumerate the ways that I think books can behave in our lives and in society. And while escape is one of them, it can't be the only one. Yes. That in fact, when we read, we do encounter injustices, sufferings, structural inequalities, and having learned about them, we do have a responsibility to do something about them. Reading, I think if I were to poke at the flaw of it, is for many people, they believe that to read about something absolves you of the responsibility, when in fact, the author put it down on paper, not with the hope of absolution for her or his readers, but I believe on some deep level, whether consciously or not, with the hope that somebody would actually do something about it.
Well, and to change the world.
And to change the world. And to change the world, exactly. And one of the things too is not only in a kind of didactic way, but I also think that when writers write about, for example, the small cruelties that lead to great character flaws and great atrocities, they're training us to be attuned to those cruelties so that we can be alert to them before they become these massive flaws. And fiction for me does some of that too. Reading about the way in a Thackeray, for example, Dickens, the way that characters treat each other. Who gives you a hint at the start of the book that they're going to be a complete rotter, and how you can pick up on that hint.
So again, kind of guideposts to navigating your own life then.
Yes, guideposts to navigating your own life, trying to make you more alert, more aware of the behavior of people around you and the ramifications of that. But I do struggle with that idea of action.
Yeah.
The idea that I love to escape through reading. Yeah. But I really try to be strict with myself and fail, but try to make sure that I don't simply escape.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You talk about reading being an art. So how is it an art?
It's an art, and this was in the chapter about the art of archery. it comes back to what we were talking about flow, that the artist in the ultimate state is in that state of losing her or himself in the art. And the more you read, the better a reader you become, and the more you are able to lose yourself in the book and attain that state of selflessness where you and the text become one, which to me is a kind of heaven. Like any art, you just get better at it as you practice. I think you become a better reader the more you do it.
George Andreas once mentioned to me, and he's the director of the Harvard University Press, but he used to work at Knopf with Sonny Mehta. And he was talking about the fact that the more that you read, the more of a struggle it is to get caught up in the book in exactly the way you've just suggested, because you're so analytical.
He's one of the editors I most respect, and what an incredible career at both Knopf and Harvard. But that's not true for me.
Okay, that's good. Okay.
I think it may be, I'm quite good at separating my editor brain from my reader brain. I can turn off the editor brain. I think I become more analytical when I'm reading as an editor, but as a reader, I think I'm a better reader. With some exceptions. I will say that I've completely lost the ability to read Henry James. I tore through Henry James when I was a kid. I mean, not a kid, when I was in college. Yeah. And I wasn't a prodigy. I was reading Henry James at 9. No. But I just can't read Henry James now. I just can't do it.
Too verbose?
I get lost, too verbose. Yeah. I lose the thread. I can't keep it in my head.
Discovering our favorite author. Now, I don't remember who this was, but this is apparently in our intellectual development. It's a critical discovery.
That's more Lin Yu Tang. I keep coming back to Lin Yu Tang.
Okay, so why is that? Why is that?
I don't know the why. I just know the fact of it. Okay. For me, it was Christopher Isherwood. When I discovered Christopher Isherwood, I felt we were not very much alike in all sorts of ways, but I felt I had found a kind of soulmate, to use a cliche term, or someone who could tell me what I had to look forward to and help me interpret my life and kind of guide the way. And what was so great about that is there was just a wealth of Isherwood books to read once I discovered him. I once called him. It was 1982. I was in California. He was in the phone booth. I called him. I said, Mr. Isherwood, you're my favorite author. I've read everything you've written. Can I come see you? And he said, I'd be absolutely delighted. You must come around. He said, I'm not feeling very well today, but give me a call in a couple of days. And I never had the courage to call him again. But I did read later, which I was humiliated by. It had nothing to do with me. But he did say that anyone who said I've read all your work should actually, as punishment, have to read all his work. It was true. I read a lot of his work, but I hadn't read all of his work.
Well, isn't it interesting, too, that when you do really fall in love with an author's work, you in a way, you fall in love with them as well. You really want them to be your friend.
Yes. And they're bound to disappoint.
Yeah.
If you were actually to meet them in person. And I think that is exactly why I never called him again.
Yeah.
Because he is my friend now, and I adore him and I adore his books, but actually meeting him might have gotten in the way.
Yeah. Well, it was funny for me. I recently interviewed Martin Amis, and that was it was kind of surreal because I spent so much time with him. It's like he is my friend. I've laughed with him for years, and here I was actually talking to him. It was kind of a surreal experience.
Very, very surreal. Yeah, I think. I mean, I will say, I probably would have adored Christopher Isherwood and had a great time meeting him.
Yes,
so maybe I'm just doing a backward justification for my lack of courage and calling again. It doesn't have to disappoint, but it
No.
is surreal. When I've met authors that whose work I've loved, maybe not quite as much as Christopher Isherwood's, but
Yeah.
it's sometimes been quite delightful, but it is surreal.
Yeah. Now, composing a 100-book library focuses you in a way that enables you to figure out what matters to you. So how does it do that?
Well, this isn't something I do, but I use an example of a great friend who was a wonderful teacher, playwright, and one of the people I respected and loved most in the world, a man named Bob Chapman. And at points in his life, he had libraries in the thousands or even tens of thousands of books, including one of the great personal libraries about Morocco. But when he reached his 80s, he decided that he would have 100 books and that he would keep the 100 books that meant the most to him. And to add a book to the shelf, he had to get rid of one. And I think it's a great discipline for someone who wants to try that kind of experiment. And to me, I love to think it's my version of Desert Island Discs, to think if I had to have 100 books on my shelf, what would they be? But I did realize, because we always have way too many books and I'm constantly having to winnow them, my favorite books to keep on my shelf these days are actually books I haven't read. I love to have our apartment be kind of like a bookstore where I can look at a whole shelf of books that I haven't read and think kind of, ooh, what am I going to read next?
All sorts of possibilities.
When Bob died, we went to help clear out his apartment. And what was marvelous about the 100 books was that it was a portrait of him. It was a biography in books. There was a book on martinis because he loved martinis. And there was a book on Beau Geste because he loved Foreign Legion, and a book on theater. So it's a self-portrait, and a way why I wanted to write about him, and that image of the 100 books is at the end of your life, when you're gone, you are in your commonplace brain, all the books you ever read. That's part of who you are.
Yeah. Well, I think that's why it's such a great idea to, if you do have likes and dislikes, is to read up on them. Like if you like Scotch, well, read up on it. It's only going to deepen your enjoyment of drinking the Scotch.
Exactly. And Bob Chapman, this friend I was writing about, actually typed on a index card a review of every book that was in the library. Yeah. And he left it in the card. But what was fascinating to read his cards with those reviews is a lot of the books among the 100 books were books that he had violent objections to. Yeah. These weren't books that he loved uncritically. These were books that were important to him.
Right. I'm just going to read out a quick little quote here. This is from the very end of the Reading Lolita in Tehran chapter. And you said, you didn't, I think it might have been Nabokov that said it, but a book needs to be, quote, an affirmation of life against the transience of that life, an essential defiance. It just needs to be the book you need when you need it. Can you unpack that?
This was writing about a chapter about Azar Nafisi's Reading Lolita in Tehran, and about class she led for a group of students, young women, reading both Persian literature and Nabokov and Fitzgerald and other works. And to me, that quote was that it really was in the reading, this freedom, this allowing your mind to go wherever mind needed or wanted to go. Yeah. That was the essential defiance against whatever kind of constraints we put on ourselves or are put on us in cultures around the world, not just in Iran at the time, but everywhere. And that in that sense, it is a kind of act of defiance in and of itself, the reading, the imagining, and has all sorts of consequences. And that was Azar Nafisi's quote that I was, and thoughts that I was channeling. But I wrote about it specifically in the context of this phrase that people use where someone will say, oh, that book saved my life. And we were talking about hyperbole before. Sometimes it's a bit of an exaggeration, but I think actually very often it's not. And what they mean so often is not that they saved their life from death, but they saved their life from being a kind of life that was constrained.
Yeah, and you look at Lolita, I mean, what a courageous, he went someplace really dark.
Really dark. Defiance, a really active defiance.
And yeah, what a courageous writer.
Yeah. Yeah. And so courage to write, courage to imagine, defiance.
Yeah. Just winding down here, almost finished.
Such a pleasure to talk about books all day. This is my dream day.
I'm glad to hear that. I'm really enjoying it. I've come to believe that the greatest gift you can give people is to take the time to talk with them about a book you've shared. A book is a great gift. The gift of your interest and attention is even greater.
That, to me, was one of the thoughts that I really wanted to end the book with. And this may sound like a purely commercial suggestion from someone who works in the book trade, but I'll say it anyways, which is I'd love people to imagine the difference of saying to someone, I'll give you case A, case B. Mm-hmm. Case A is here for your birthday. I'm giving you Toni Morrison's Beloved, and I hope you enjoy it. I think it's an extraordinary book. Case one. Case two, here for your birthday, I'm giving you Toni Morrison's Beloved, and I've bought a copy for myself. And when you read it, I'll read it. And then let's talk about it. I want to get to know you better. I want to hear what you think of this book. I want to find out everything that makes you you, and I want to share some of that with you. And to me, one is a wonderful gift, and the other is a life-changing gift. And that's what I'm saying, is that sharing with each other experiences of books is an incredible opportunity, and one we could take advantage of so much more. And I know as a book trade person, I've just sold 2 books instead of 1, but it's very sincere that we could do a lot more of that.
That's such a beautiful sentiment. I wholeheartedly agree with it. Now, given the time that we're in, and I mean very precisely what's going on right now with Trump and your government, you've got the book there, right?
Yes.
Could I ask you to read out this paragraph on page 257, starting with "Books Remain"?
I was hoping you would ask me to read that paragraph. Books remain one of the strongest bulwarks we have against tyranny, but only as long as people are free to read all different kinds of books, and only as long as they actually do so. The right to read whatever you want, whenever you want, is one of the fundamental rights that helps preserve all the other rights. It's a right we need to guard with unwavering diligence, but it's also a right we can guard with pleasure. Reading isn't just a strike against narrowness, mind control, and domination. It's one of the world's great joys.
Well, it's been a great joy to talk to you, Will, about your book. Thank you.
Thank you, Nigel. It's been such a joy for me too. I really appreciate it.
The book is Books for Living by Will Schwalbe, published by Knopf. What are you working on now?
I am just finished a baggy, incoherent draft of a new book, but I do have a new book, and it's about a 40-year friendship with someone totally different from me. And it's great fun to write. Difficult, challenging, because it's 40 years. Well,
we'll look forward to reading that.
Great. And what are you reading and recommending now? Is the new Martin Amis, I take it, is spectacular.
It's terrific. Yeah, I think yeah, it just puts you in such a good frame of mind, me anyway. When
Yeah.
I'm reading it, I'm smiling the whole time.
My brother's obsessed with Martin Amis, so he was telling me yesterday he was right in the middle of it. And what's next for you?
Well, I should mention another book that I loved. It's called The Bookseller's Tale by Martin Latham. That was a delight. It was all sorts of really fascinating tales about the whole book trade over the centuries, and libraries, and and marginalia. That was really fascinating.
Gosh, I've got to look at that one. And so I have good suggestions. I have that. I have Rabelais Booksellers, and sorry, just a minute, and I'll let you go. I didn't mean to take your whole day.
No.
One of my actually favorite books that I always have on my bookshelf is The Seed and the Sower by Lawrence Vanderpost. Which is about the camps during World War II, the Japanese POW camps. It was made into the movie Merry Christmas, Mr. Lawrence. But I was wondering, what, if you don't mind, because that part of history fascinates me, was your grandfather in the colonial, what was he sort of, was he serving over there? What was he doing?
He was a doctor, a surgeon. He was in Hong Kong when it was captured. I think it was 3 or 4 years he was in there. He went in over 200 pounds and came out around 100 pounds.
Oh, that is such a desperate time.
Yeah. I haven't really read that much about it, but I plan to, as I say, I've got these sort of family related stuff that I want to do when I'm really old.
Yes.
I'm already old, but when I'm really old. But I did want to mention to you something that I'm just about to launch. It's kind of a harebrained idea, but I'm going to give it a shot. And it basically is, I'm calling them my literary retreats. And I'm going to try and convince some CEOs and corporate people to do 4 or 5 day book reading retreats with me. Now, I don't know if it's going to work, and I'm sure others have tried it, but I've just been working on the website, so it should be ready in a week or so, I think. So,
fantastic! I think it's a great idea. I've never heard of anything structured around an actual retreat. I think that's a really marvelous idea. Oh, keep me posted when the website's live.
Yes.
Shoot me a link.
Yeah, and if you could spread the word, that'd be great. Yeah,
I love the idea. I think it's a great idea. So,
but you said it so beautifully. It's that's the selling point of it, is that if a team of executives, 5 or 6, because I wouldn't want it to be any bigger than that, can get together and read a 100-page text and really tear it apart together over a 3, 4, 5 day period, they'll get to know each other in a new way, as you've said.
Yeah.
And I think it's a great team building exercise too.
I love it. It's a great idea. So yes, as soon as you're ready to have me spread the word, let me send a link.
Okay. That's
great. All right. Well, it's such a pleasure. I'm so happy. It was a great bit of serendipity to start the year. So
terrific.
All right. Thanks so much, Nigel. Take care.